Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. We've done a number of shows and had many conversations about the recent case in California involving Facebook and YouTube, and of course, social media. But I never really thought of it, or we've never really discussed it in the context of free speech. There was an interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal late last month by my guest and his fellow author, Jeff Kossoff, about this issue or this trial in the context of what the headline suggests as the timeless fear of corrupting the youth. I think this essay is part of an argument put forward in a new book, The Future of Free Speech by Mchangama and Jeff Kossoff. Jeff was actually on the show last year. So we've got Jakob on now. Jakob, congratulations on the new book, The Future of Free Speech. You're talking to us from Franklin, Tennessee. You're involved with the Institute of Free Speech at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Before we get into the details of the book, Jakob, how does, in your view, this recent trial in California involving YouTube and Facebook connect with the issue of free speech?
Well, children have First Amendment rights too. And so when you're trying to say that product design is not really about speech, you're trying to essentially circumvent the First Amendment and Section 230. I know you've had a very long, heated discussion with Jeff Kossoff about my co-author about Section 230, and we placed these trials in the context of really a tsunami of laws that, with age verification, prohibiting minors from accessing, from being on social media, based on the premise that the increase in mental health problems among teens is caused by their access to social media and smartphones. And I'm not an expert on those. I would just say that a lot of the experts on this do not necessarily agree that there's causation between smartphone time, social media use, and mental health problems. An argument prominently made by Jonathan Haidt, who's been the direct inspiration for some of these laws. But even if we do assume that there are harms, direct harms, that should not be the end of it, because social media and smartphones are not like tobacco. Tobacco is, if you smoke cigarettes, that is clearly dangerous to you, and there are no real benefits, specifically not benefits in terms of speech. But yeah, when you use, my kids, when we moved from Denmark to Tennessee, I have two teenagers. I'm very concerned about their social media use, and the time they spend on smartphones, I limit it through parental controls. But they also derive benefits from it. For instance, their viewing of videos means that their English is completely fluent, that they understand the cultural idioms of their peers in school, making it easier to integrate. My son runs a car detailing business. How do you start up a car detailing business? Well, you watch online videos to get you to help you, and so on. So so in that sense, if you cut children off from social media or smartphones, you also cut them off from access to information that can be vital to some, especially maybe vulnerable communities. And then there's the whole problem that you will undermine privacy, anonymity by age verification. And of course, if you go back throughout the history of free speech, Tom Paine's Common Sense was not written in the name of Tom Paine. Baruch Spinoza's theological political treatise was not written in the name of Baruch Spinoza. John Locke's two treatises of government was not written in the name of John Locke. they used anonymity or pseudonyms because that was a way of circumventing censorship. It was a way to make very important arguments without, or at least minimizing the risk of being punished. And the internet works the same way. Lots of people say things, want to access, share information, but don't necessarily want their name out there, and for good reasons, because you can risk consequences for that. For instance, we see in a well-established democracy like Germany, politicians enjoy a special protection against insult. So lots of powerful politicians have the police turn up at the door of ordinary German citizens who have said something that these politicians don't like, which is a good reason why you want to be anonymous. You want to be able to speak truth to power, as it is.
You're quite an expert on free speech. Not only do you run the free speech, the Future of Free Speech Institute at Vanderbilt, and you're the co-author of this new book, The Future of Free Speech, but you're also the author of Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. So you know your free speech, Jakob. This new book suggests a global decline of democracy's most essential freedom. Where's the evidence of that? You mentioned the internet. Of course, I'm not always particularly keen on social media, but when you go on social media, it seems as if, especially on a platform like X, you can pretty much say anything you want, which is why a lot of people think of it as rather distasteful. Where's the evidence, Jakob, of this global decline of free speech?
Yeah, so there's a paradox here in that, on the one hand, we've never had better access to information and better ability to connect immediately with people around the world without prior censorship. That has exploded with the World Wide Web, with social media, now with generative AI. But at the same time, we're also living in a time where the original sort of techno-optimistic promise has been turned on its head. So if you go back to the 1990s and early 2000s, that was a intensely optimistic time. Democracy was being spread to all corners of the world. It was sort of the peak of the third wave of democratization. And then the internet came along, and there was this widespread belief that the internet would make it impossible for governments to censor information again, and therefore censorship and authoritarianism would be consigned to the ash heap of history. In 2000, Bill Clinton wants to admit China into the WTO, and he says, yeah, sure, they're going to try and censor the internet. And then he laughs and says, well, good luck with that. That's like nailing Jello to a wall. And I think the Chinese have perfected the art of nailing Jello to a wall. And so essentially we have that period where the spread of democracy and free speech go hand in hand. But if you look at the data first and foremost, if you look at data from the varieties of democracy, probably the most sophisticated data set of indicators, you see that the number of countries where free speech is declined has increased dramatically, whereas the number of countries where free speech is being strengthened the number of countries where free speech is in decline has increased dramatically, and the number of countries where free speech is being strengthened is quite small, and that has gone hand in hand with a wider democracy recession.
You talk about recession, democracy recession. Is free speech, or in your view at least, the decline of free speech, is that really the crisis of democracy these days? Is that why some people see democracy in some sort of existential crisis? You use the term recession. Some people might even use the word depression or Great Recession.
No, I mean, one of the things that I think is that a lot of people, you hinted at it, a lot of people in democracies view free speech as a threat to democracy. They have come to believe that the internet, with social media, polarization, disinformation, spread of hate speech, and so on, threatens democracy. And therefore, we need in democracies to have more regulation of speech. We need to do more to clamp down on social media. We need to do more to clamp down on disinformation. We need to do more to clamp down on hate speech. The argument in the book is that these attempts in democracies may be born out of good intentions, but they are extremely counterproductive, and they ignore the fact that the history of democracy and freedom is built on the back, if you like, of speech, and have gone hand in hand with the expansion of speech. And also that authoritarian states, the number one indicator for authoritarian states, or states that are moving towards authoritarianism, is that they focus on limiting free expression. And I think so in many democracies, I think we've come to take free speech, the benefits of free speech, for granted, and focus almost exclusively on the dark sides, the ugly sides of free speech, which admittedly are more visible today because of the digital environment that we live in. But once you start clamping down on speech, it will have serious collateral damage, and we're starting to see that now in democracies, where some of these laws that I've talked about have real consequences far beyond their intended scope.
Before we get to some of those consequences, I know there's an autobiographical element here. You've said that you grew up in, well, there's no saying, you grew up in Denmark, where you said most Danes considered free speech to be not to be a matter of debate, because it was as natural as breathing the air. And then, of course, came in 2005 the famous Muhammad cartoon controversy. Have you been shaped, Jakob, by this controversy, growing up in Denmark, which does have a tradition from the outside of being a paragon of openness, of free speech, of toleration? How did this 2005 cartoon scandal shape not just Denmark, but yourself?
Yeah, I think it's the main reason why I've sort of dedicated my professional life to free speech, because as she's, in that quote, I say that I took free speech for granted. I didn't really think much about free speech because it was essentially a value that had been won. And the last place where you would, in Denmark, where you thought that any sort of existential threat to free speech might come from was religion. And then suddenly you had the cartoon crisis, where a Danish newspaper published these cartoons that and I applaud you for this, for actually showing them, because many mainstream newspapers would not, even though obviously it's relevant to show them to, what is this about? And what I saw
I mean, why wouldn't you show it? You think
because a lot of people have lived with death threats, and some have been killed. I use them. I've never had any problems, but you never know. Because that's one of the problems, right? There are people out there in the world who are willing to kill because of religious doctrines, and that was something that we had thought in Denmark had long since gone away. And what I saw in Denmark was large parts of sort of the left, who saw themselves as the heirs to Enlightenment values, suddenly said, whoa, free speech is good, but you can't use it to punch down on a vulnerable minority, here being Muslims, where they interpreted these cartoons as an attack on all Muslims. When in fact, if you read the accompanying editorial, it talks about the importance of free speech applying to all. So if you really believe in equality for all, it would be very weird to have a situation where one group in a society enjoy special protections from having their taboos questioned or criticized or ridiculed, and others do not. But then what I saw in Denmark was also, and of course, it's perfectly fine to find the cartoons distasteful or offensive. It's also perfectly fine to use speech to condemn them morally if you find that that you think they're a needless provocation. That depends on individual taste. There's no real right or wrong answer. I thought they were contributing to an important debate, but that's my point of view. That's not a universal truth. The problem is that people were willing to use violence. There were several terrorist threats and attacks. The editor who commissioned the cartoons became a friend of mine. He had to live for a decade with round-the-clock security from the Danish intelligence services because people wanted to kill him because he had asked people to draw cartoons with pens, and they wanted to come after him with AK-47s.
And of course, all this came on top of the Rushdie fatwa.
All of that came after the Rushdie, and 10 years later was the Charlie Hebdo attack. So the attack against Charlie Hebdo in Paris, this French left-wing satirical magazine, which had been one of the few magazines that had shown solidarity with Jyllands-Posten, the Danish newspaper, and actually republished the cartoons as an act of solidarity. And that was one of the main reasons why 12 people were murdered that day when two jihadists entered their offices and gunned down.
Right. So again, we don't need to go over all this stuff. Is the argument in the future of free speech and we've done a lot of shows on this sort of thing. Are you arguing against wokeness? Are you suggesting that the real problem these days with free speech is the left, of toleration of minorities, worrying about insulting Muslims or people of different skin colors or genders or sexualities or economic status? Is that the core politics of the future of speech? Is that why you think there's a global decline? Is it coming from the left, Jakob?
No, and right now in this country, a lot of the people who talk a big game about free speech and who complained, I think, with some merit about cultural censorship coming from the left, are now enthusiastically embracing restrictions from the Trump administration that have come from the government. Fortunately, the United States has a very robust protection of political speech in the First Amendment, where courts have, by and large, hindered the most vindictive and punitive attempts to silence critics by the Trump administration. But I don't know a recent American administration that has gone to the lengths to punish criticism as the Trump administration has. And I think this is this is one of the reasons why I think what you talked about before, that there's been this on the left sort of uneasiness about free speech, because free speech allows people to say things about minorities, and therefore we need to restrict it. One of the things that we argue in this book, we have a chapter called "For Hateful Men." It shows how some of the most important U.S. Supreme Court decisions that protect free speech deal with extremely hateful people who are viciously anti-Semites or even members of the KKK. And very often you had civil rights organizations, blacks and Jews, defending them out of principle because they acknowledge that if you're a minority, a vulnerable, persecuted minority, you depend more than the majority on the ability to challenge power. You depend on a principled protection of free speech. Unfortunately, that history has largely been forgotten, I think, by many. So we're not, free speech will, depending on circumstances, be under attack from the left, from the right, even centrists. What we argue for is a robust, principled, consistent protection of free speech. But what we also do is to say, well, it's not enough for free speech advocates such as ourselves to just say, talk about John Stuart Mill or the importance of being principled or the dangers of the slippery slope. We argue, we point to concrete tools that are fueled, empowered by free speech that you can use, such as counter speech, crowdsourced fact-checking, radical transparency, and so on. Instances that have actually been implemented around the world, and that is a much healthier alternative to censorship and speech restrictions.
Um, yeah, and in that sense, your concern, both from the left and the right, I think it reflects or echoes Greg Luciano from Fire. He's been on the show a number of times. I know you work closely with him. A couple of years ago, he came on worrying about the left. Then he was on last year suggesting that, like you, he fears the right in some ways more than the left these days. Going back to John Stuart Mill, who, of course, is the father, I'm not sure of free speech, but certainly of liberalism. You're the historian of free speech, and I know you go way back before Mill in your book, back to Socrates and democracies in antiquity, through to Abu Bakr al-Razi and Ida D. Wells in modern American history. But are you like Mill? Are you a utilitarian when it comes to free speech? After all, the philosophical question is, why should we care about free speech? What's the big deal? So what? So are you and Jeff and are you personally in this book and in your thinking, are you a utilitarian? Are you suggesting that the best argument in favor of free speech is that it enables, I don't know, social progress?
I am actually not, well, I don't want to speak for Jeff. I am not one of those who believes in one free speech theory to rule them all. I think that there are a number of very strong justifications for free speech that are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. So utilitarianism is a big part of it. I think it's absolutely undeniable that free speech has been gone hand in hand with social progress. At least if you buy into a broadly liberal democratic mindset, that free speech has gone hand in hand with that. It has also been instrumental for scientific progress. But I also think that there's a very strong moral component to free speech. Freedom of conscience. Baruch Spinoza, the famous early Enlightenment Dutch Jewish philosopher, said something along the lines that it's a natural right for everyone to have the freedom to think what they want and say what they think, and that it is tyrannical for any government to try and essentially censor what that if you can't speak your mind, how can you be free? So that's an intensely moral argument, and more broadly, we call it democracy's most essential freedom, because I do believe it serves as a meta right really for democracy. So it is essential for a number of goods, both consequentialist and moral in nature.
Let's go back to Haidt, because perhaps not H-A-T-E, but Jonathan Haidt, perhaps awkwardly named. Do you think that we know about the threat of the right and the left, of the woke left and of the authoritarian right to free speech and freedom? But do you think that people like Haidt offer a liberal threat to free speech, in the sense, when it comes to technology, they take away agency? They suggest, particularly with children, that children don't have the agency to say no. You compared it to smoking earlier. Is there perhaps, in some ways, is the real danger to free speech, Jakob, in 2026, coming from guys like Haidt?
I mean, Jonathan Haidt has done a lot to advance free speech and academic freedom.
Well, his own free speech. I don't know about anybody else.
No, I mean his earlier work, which is also why it's surprising.
Yeah, with Lukianov, of course.
With Lukianov, I think, and he founded Heterodox Academy that works for academic freedom at universities and so on. And I admire a lot of his work. He's clearly a very intelligent person. And I also share some of his concerns. As I said, I think that he writes he in his earlier work he writes about the elephant and the rider, about how sort of our prior beliefs essentially make us argue for certain things, so that we mold our arguments according to our prior beliefs. motivated reasoning. And I think there's an element perhaps of motivated reasoning in his sort of crusade for age verification. I wouldn't say that he's the biggest threat to free speech. I mean, China is obviously a huge threat to free speech globally. Russia is obviously.
Well, I don't know if China or Russia threats to free speech in the United States, are they?
Well, I mean, I would say that China tries very hard to export its cutting-edge technology with the purpose of censoring speech around the world. Russia helps try to change global norms that could ultimately have an impact on free speech around the world. But I do think that centrists, well-intentioned liberal Democrats can also be a threat to free speech, and this is something that we've seen, particularly after 2016, the U.S. presidential election, where for a long time there was this narrative that Russian disinformation had contributed to deciding the presidential election in favor of Donald Trump. I think this is a claim that has since been largely debunked, but it led to a lot of concerns about social media. Then you had COVID and the so-called infodemic. And in 2024, after generative AI became the big thing, 2024 was the super election year where around 2 billion people were eligible to vote around the world. And alarmist headlines in New York Times and Washington Post was that democracy risked drowning in disinformation. World Economic Forum said that disinformation was the largest short-term threat against humanity. And what we saw was that those who studied these elections could not really identify AI-generated disinformation as having impacted an election. That there was lots of use of it, some of it probably malicious, some of it intended to mislead, but there was no real evidence that it had sort of shifted outcomes. And I think this is very typical of what I call elite panic, that every time there's every time the public sphere is expanded through new communications technology, the traditional gatekeepers tend to fret about the consequences of allowing the unwashed mob direct and unmediated access to information, because it's disruptive, right? And we do live in a disruptive age, right? Institutional authority has been eroded as we know it. A trust in cultural, academic, media institution is at an all-time low. And so we're trying to model our way through the new digital age. And I think that makes it tempting for well-meaning liberal Democrats to say, well, we need some kind of top-down control to try and create order out of the chaos.
So somebody like Haidt is an example of the panic of the elites against maybe free speech or certainly some sort of freedom. We got a show coming up in the next couple of weeks with the New York Times writer Gal Beckerman. He has a very interesting new book, How to Be a Dissident. You're a historian of free speech. Of course, you've written extensively in that book about Socrates, perhaps the original dissident. Is being a dissident, if that's the right word, is it about being brave enough to say what you think? Jaco? You noted that I was brave to put this image of on Wikipedia up. I don't think that there's any bravery in that. I mean, it's on Wikipedia, so I don't see why I should put it up. But how does one, if indeed there is a global crisis of free speech,
mm-hmm.
How does one become a dissident? What does everybody from Socrates to Demosthenes, you write about in your book, to Abu Bakr al-Razi, to, of course, the great Ida B. Wells, what do they tell us about being a dissident in an age of retreating free speech?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to use the term dissident in the American context and sort of most liberal democratic states, just because even though I warn that things are getting bad in liberal democracies, no one in the UK or America is facing
Okay, but I take your
what
point. But
what
let's
Navalny. Yeah,
let's assume that's the book
no, but it's
in
important.
China or Iran or Russia.
Yeah. Obviously, it depends on bravery a lot, because there is no legal or institutional protection of your right to free speech, and so you have to be incredibly brave to criticize regimes when you know that can lead to your imprisonment, torture, or even death. And unfortunately, that is to a large extent how free speech has been won. Right? People have spoken out against um, power of monarchs, of churches, of rulers, of one-party states, often at a very high cost. And we have, especially in democracies, realized that the ability to do so is absolutely essential for pluralistic societies that respect the rights of the individual, that and where no one can have no political party, no government, um, no regime can have a monopoly on truth. So that's important. But I would say that in democracies, we still need to. I think ultimately, the happy state of the First Amendment in the United States, even though it's under pressure, depends ultimately on a civic commitment to a culture of free speech, meaning that if a critical mass of Americans decide that free speech is no longer worth to defend or believe in as a basic principle, then very likely 20 years from now, the First Amendment will be interpreted very differently by future Supreme Court justices who don't share that belief in sort of free speech exceptionalism that currently dominates First Amendment doctrine. And of course, that has been the case in American history. It's actually relatively recent that the First Amendment really got a bite for a very long time. You know, if you were an opponent of American involvement in World War One, in the first half of the 20th century, you could be sent to prison for 10 years. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's fine. That's not protected speech.
We had a Albanian writer on the show, and she's been on actually a couple of times. You may be familiar with her work, Leah Upi.
Yes.
She wrote a wonderful autobiography of growing up in Hodges, Albania, called Freedom. You probably have the book. Yeah.
I can't just find it.
And in the book, she tells the story of growing up, that her family invented a language to describe reality so that people wouldn't know what they were talking about. So they appeared to be talking about their uncles and their aunts and their relatives, but actually they were using the language of criticizing the regime. The reason I bring her up is, aren't we humans always able to get around free speech? If you're not allowed to say certain things, then we just figure out ways of saying them differently.
I mean, it's impossible to censor all speech. I think that is true. Human beings are resourceful, adaptable. So there will always be ways to challenge it, but you can certainly create an environment where lots of speech is being removed or chilled or self-censored. Imagine living in current day China, where the online sphere, the digital sphere, is heavily censored through AI, where facial recognition technology is implemented into cameras, where essentially you, as a citizen, you're completely transparent to the government. That will obviously mean that you're very, very careful about what you say. And it will also, with time, mean that citizens, or most citizens at least, will no longer be aware of basic facts. I mean, it's not uncommon for younger Chinese, well-educated Chinese, to not know what happened on Tiananmen Square that because it's an event that has been so heavily censored um, by the Chinese Communist Party that younger generations are just not aware that a student movement, a pro-democracy student movement, was was brutally suppressed with many killed not that long ago. So that's obviously a huge danger in countries with a lot of censorship. And also, I mean, you could talk about, if a government, if you have a government where you have censorship and you surround yourself with sycophants, then that there's a real danger that you end up taking wrong and delusional decisions, right? Because
Oh,
you
I can't
don't.
imagine. I can't imagine that scenario, Jakob.
No,
Let's end with AI. Some people
yeah.
see it as the end of humanity. I'm not sure what humanity actually means. Um, how does AI threaten free speech, or how might it offer an opportunity for pushing back what you call this global decline? I mean, it's not possible to have a conversation about anything these days without bringing up AI.
No.
You touched on it earlier. There's a lot of hysterical talk about the impact of technology, social media. We began with social media and the trial in Los Angeles, fining YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah.
What's the forecast from you, the expert on free speech, for AI? Are you excited, worried, a little bit of both?
I'm mostly excited and optimistic, but I'm also worried. So in the book, we talk about what we call creative AI and intrusive AI. So creative AI is the way that, essentially generative AI gives you superpowers on demand, right? So I like to read the Odyssey and the Iliad, and I've used a chatbot as essentially a tutor, like a PhD level tutor that I have, that just gives me a depth of understanding that I couldn't have gotten on my own. I can do set up agents that help me do research in real time at a depth and scope that would be unimaginable before. So it gives us access to information that is incredible and powers to do incredible things. But it's also true that AI can be supercharged to create the most intrusive regimes of surveillance and censorship the world has ever seen. Imagine if Hitler or Stalin had the powers that the Chinese Communist Party has now. That is a frightening thought in and of itself. And so for me, it's crucial that sort of the commitment to creative AI works. But what you talk about the sort of some of the hysteria, and there's a lot of talk about regulating it and sort of saying we have to make sure that AI can never hallucinate, or that it doesn't spread disinformation and so on. But if you sort of have a commitment to what we call preemptive safetyism, AI is a general purpose technology, right? You can use it for good or bad. The same way that this laptop I'm sitting with, and with an internet connection, I could use that to send out scam emails. I could use it to send out threats. I could mass produce and easily distribute anti-Semitic neo-Nazi propaganda if I wanted to, at a scale unimaginable to anyone in the time of the printing press. But we don't say that you're only allowed to use to produce and sell laptops if you can't do illegal stuff with them, or have an internet connection if you can't do illegal stuff. And I think we have to think the same way about AI. We want to make sure that we try and guard as best we can against catastrophic risks, but not filter information and ideas, because AI is also embedded into search, word processing, emails, and so on. So if you allow a government or a company to filter AI, you essentially allow them to filter the entire ecosystem of ideas and information, and that is hugely dangerous.
Well, there you have it. The future of free speech. If I was in charge, I wouldn't allow the word Mchangama, because it's so hard for podcast presenters like myself to pronounce. But I've done as good a job as I can, Jakob. Good job. Good way of presenting, defending, promoting free speech. It's an essential thing, and you're one of our leading exponents. The new book is out. It's co-authored with Jeff Kossoff, who was on the show last year. So good job with that. And this subject is certainly not going away. Maybe we'll get you on the show in future with your friend Greg Lukianoff. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.